This opportunity to present you the major findings of our special report on 1.5. 3 years ago, the parties to the UNFCCC invited the IPCC to look at the impacts of global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius and the emissions pathway comparable to that goal. Parties to UNFCCC asked us to deliver this report this year. And in accepting this invitation, the IPCC went beyond the original invitation and framed the report in the context of sustainable development and the eradication of poverty. We worked very hard, and we recruited on the basis of nominations from 195 member governments, 91 authors, from 40 countries, and these lead authors assessed well over 6,000 scientific literature, and drafts were reviewed by over 1,000 expert reviewers who provided close to 40,000 comments. The lead authors were obligated to address each and every comment. This review process is very important for us, the IPCC process, to safeguard the integrity and the objectivity of our assessment. Just a month ago, the IPCC plenary spent an entire week to arrive at a summary for policymakers, with member governments scrutinizing, agreeing, and approving, and then accepting the summary for policymakers, and then accepting the main underlying reports as well. If I had to sum it up in a very few words, I would say every bit of warming matters and every bit of human action matters. I would like to give you 4 key takeaways from our findings. Firstly, the climate change is already affecting people, the ecosystem, and livelihoods all around the world. Secondly, the limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius is not impossible, but it will require unprecedented transitions in all aspects of life. Thirdly, there are clear benefits to keeping warming to 1.5 degrees rather than 2 degrees or higher. As I said before, every bit of warming matters. And finally, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees can go hand in hand with achieving other societal goals. This report confirms, first of all, that human activities have already caused warming of about 1 degrees since the pre-industrial times. If the current rate of warming continues, then the global temperature is likely to reach 1.5 degrees between 2030 and 2052. There's an inertia in the climate system. The past emissions accumulated so far will continue to cause temperature rise and changes in the climate system. But our report finds that past emissions alone are not likely to cause warming of 1.5 degrees, which means that what the world will do from now matters greatly regarding the limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. Our report shows that the limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees implies reducing the CO2 emissions by about 45% by 2030 compared to the 2010 levels, and then to net zero by 2050. This trajectory of carbon emission reductions would give us a 2/3 chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, and the least reliance on carbon dioxide removal. The short name is CDR, the so-called negative emissions technologies. The CDR is a measure to reduce the stock of carbon already accumulated in the atmosphere, and it is a measure to reduce global warming in addition to measures to reduce the flow of carbon to the atmosphere. Our report finds that the nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement would lead to greenhouse gas emissions in 2030 of about 52 through 58 gigaton of CO2 equivalent that year. The current efforts would not limit, obviously, the global warming to 1.5 degrees. To meet that goal, 2030 emissions should be around 25 through 30 gigaton of CO2 per year. The current effort would lead to at least 3 degrees warming by the end of this century. Now, limiting the warming to 1.5 degrees is achievable, it's not impossible. It requires a world of low energy demand, electrification of final energy consumption, zero carbon electricity, and zero carbon liquid fuel, and sustainable food consumption. Technically, all of these elements would be possible. Now, key impediments are the lack of global cooperation, lack of governance of land transformation, and lack of societal will to correct the resource-intensive consumption. The cooperation at international level and domestic level as well, involving the local government, regional government, national government, with private sector, civil societies, and indigenous people, certainly facilitate these transitions. The transitions means rapid, substantial technological change and changes in the behavior. Now, the modeled pathways, the models that analyzes the future scenarios are not that well equipped to address this rapid technological changes and behavioral aspects. So based upon the performance model so far, we believe that the current model pathways may underestimate the speed of transitions that may take place in the near future. All pathways limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees requires the use of CDR on the order of 100 through 1,000 gigaton of CO2. These are for two reasons. The first is to offset any remaining CO2 emissions from transport, agriculture, and industry. And secondly, to return global temperature back to 1.5 degrees if temperature rose beyond 1.5 degrees. CDR includes planting trees, currently estimated to about $50 per ton of carbon removed, and soil carbon sequestration, currently estimated about $100 per ton of carbon removed, and BECCS, bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, currently estimated to about $200 per ton of carbon removed, and some other novel technologies such as direct air captures, which are at this time speculative. But potential for planting trees is limited to about 3.6 gigaton of CO2 per year, and which is lower than bioenergy capture and storage and soil carbon sequestrations at 5 gigaton per year each. The report analyzes 4 illustrative pathways differentiated by energy demand growth and the reliance on the CDR, particularly the BECCS, bioenergy CCS. The low energy demand pathways make it feasible for 1.5 degrees without the use of bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. CDR deployment of several hundreds of gigaton of CO2 is subject to multiple feasibility and sustainability constraints. This is because very high land and water footprints of these technologies. BECCS, for instance, requires at the most 46% of cropland in 2100 that is required for average amount of bioenergy, carbon capture, and storage. And forest CDR requires even higher land footprints than bioenergy, carbon capture, and storage. And secondly, the global impacts on nutrients and albedo of the CDR measures are uncertain at this time. And also there are questions on the permanence of carbon storage through these CDR measures. Thus, the lower the emission in 2030, the lower the challenge in limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees after 2030 with or limited overshoot. And thus, the delayed action would cause lock-in carbon-emitting infrastructure, stranded assets, reduced flexibility in future responsive options, there is more reliance on CDR, carbon dioxide removal, and also shifting the burden of responsibility to future generations. As I mentioned earlier, human activity has already led to a 1 degree warming and has already caused impacts on natural and human systems. This report on 1.5, special report on 1.5, confirms that, finds that at current warming, most land regions experienced a greater warming than the global average, especially the Arctic region, 2 to 3 times higher warming. And already 20 to 40% of world population live in the area where warming has been more than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, at least one season. And higher risk areas have been identified, again, through this report: Arctic, dryland regions, and small island regions, and the least developed countries. This study finds that at current warming, 1 degree warming, out-migration in the agricultural-dependent communities is found statistically significant in the association with global temperatures. And also, it confirms that current warming contributed to economic slowdown in the tropics and the southern hemisphere subtropic countries. The level of risk for coral reefs, the Arctic biodiversity, this time was found to be very high risk. In our last assessment, AR5, the risk of these 3 elements termed a moderate risk. So level of risk increased for these 3 types of systems. And we also confirmed that the increase in the frequency and the severity of the heat waves and the heavy precipitation turned out to be quite severe. Our report, in addition to finding of very disturbing influences on the system of the current warming, finds that a robust differences of impacts between present day 1.5 degrees and 2.0 degrees. By 2100, the global mean sea level rise will be about 10 centimeter less compared to 2 degrees if the world achieves 1.5 degrees Celsius. This means that 10 million fewer people will be exposed to the risk of sea level rise. The Arctic will be sea ice free in the summer, once in 100 years at 1.5 degrees, where it is a 1 in 10 years at 2 degree warming. Risks of a global aggregate economic growth, risks of the economic growth slowdown at 1.5 to 2.0 degrees turned out to be assessed to be very high. In our last assessment, such high risk of economic growth slowdown would happen. At that time was considered the global warming of 3 degrees. Crop yields will show differential quite significant. The average global maize crop yields at 1.5 degrees will reduce 10%, and if the warming increases additional 0.5, reaching 2 degrees, the crop loss will be 15%. Now, if the warming goes to 3 degrees, the assessment indicates that some parts of the region, in agricultural region, will subject to a tipping point. The biodiversity also will be severely affected. 6% of insects and 8% of plants and 4% of vertebrates will lose their habitats at 1.5 degree warming, and at 2 degree warming, such a loss will double. The global warming in excess of 1.5 degrees may trigger instabilities in the Greenland and Arctic ice sheets. This will create a number of rippling effects throughout the world. In sum, the report shows that limiting the warming to 1.5 degrees through a mixture of measures to adapt and mitigate reduced emissions will have benefits for meeting the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We found that knowledge alone would not lead to climate action. Very often, habits, biases work against taking climate action, even when this would have a very clear benefits. We hope that this report, as well as 7 more reports the IPCC will produce in the next 4 years, would help create opportunities for reflection and encourage ambitious decisions and provide a context for overcoming inertia and status quo bias. We are sure that the unprecedented transformative change will come to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, but with them also come the new opportunities for growth and sustainable development for all. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you for this opportunity to share this information.